The alley exploded in blood and concrete as a mid-tier Supe slammed through a brick wall, spine shattered before the scream finished forming. Security cameras died one by one, not from sabotage, but because the shadows beneath them moved first. By the time the sirens reached the block, the bodies were already wrong, still, intact, and standing where they fell. Witnesses swore the man responsible didn't fly, didn't shout, didn't pose. He walked through the chaos like it was already cleared. Every Supe who rushed him vanished into the dark, their powers ending without spectacle. When Homelander arrived, expecting applause and obedience, he found silence instead. The bodies behind the stranger rose at the same time, eyes hollow, movements synchronized. Not resurrected, claimed. Vought analysts would later confirm the impossible truth too late. This wasn't a Supe, this wasn't Compound V. This was Sung Jin-Woo, and the shadows gathering at his feet were only the first wave of something the world could no longer stop. You're not watching a one-off incident. You're witnessing the moment this world crossed a line it can't uncross. Every choice from here forward has consequences, and some of them haven't shown their faces yet. Subscribe once, or miss the judgments that decide who survives what comes next. The first reports didn't sound unusual for New York. A B-list Supe chasing a suspect through a warehouse district, collateral damage stacking up faster than the police response. Concrete dust, overturned cars, screaming civilians caught between ego and spectacle. It was the kind of mess Vought's PR team could spin before sunrise. The difference this time was how quickly the screaming stopped. By the time patrol units reached the alley, the Supe wasn't moving. His body had punched through 2 brick walls before landing twisted on the pavement, spine visibly bent where it shouldn't bend. There were no burn marks, no blast radius, no impact craters suggesting a stronger Supe had hit him. It looked like he had simply been folded in half by something that didn't need momentum. A security camera caught 3 seconds of footage before cutting to static, a hooded figure stepping out of the dark. No running, no rush, no aggression in the posture. The Supe charged first, confident and loud, hands glowing with kinetic force. The figure moved once. The Supe's glow vanished mid-stride. Then his body flew backward as if the air itself had struck him. The officers noticed something else before they secured the scene. The shadows around the alley weren't falling correctly. The streetlight behind the body cast light at the wrong angle, and the dark patches on the ground seemed thicker, almost layered. One cop swore he saw movement inside them. He didn't report that part. 2 blocks away, a civilian video uploaded before Vought's suppression teams flagged it. A man walking calmly down the sidewalk while 3 Supes lay unconscious behind him. Not dead, not bleeding, just finished. The caption read, "This guy doesn't even look like a Supe." The video gained 80,000 views in 6 minutes before it disappeared. Inside Vought International, analysts replayed the footage frame by frame. They couldn't find any Compound V markers, no known power signature, no heat spike, no radiation anomaly, no sonic distortion. The man fought like someone who had done this 1,000 times before, but not like any Supe they had ever manufactured. They labeled him unknown asset and sent a retrieval team. That team never reported back. When their GPS trackers stopped moving, Vought assumed equipment failure. When the biomonitors flatlined simultaneously, the assumption shifted to hostile engagement. When satellite footage showed their armored van parked neatly at the curb with no signs of struggle, the tone inside the room changed completely. Because standing beside the vehicle was the same hooded figure, waiting. He wasn't hiding, he wasn't fleeing. He was observing the city like it was a map he was learning. By the time Homelander received the call, Vought's fear had already turned clinical. They didn't ask him to eliminate the target. They asked him to assess. That word alone irritated him enough to arrive within 90 seconds. He landed hard enough to crack the street beneath his boots, cape settling as civilians scattered. His eyes scanned the area, expecting to find another arrogant Supe waiting for attention. Instead, he saw a quiet man standing beside an empty van, hands in his coat pockets, gaze steady and unreadable. Homelander spoke first, voice carrying false patience. He asked what the man thought he was doing in his city. There was no response, no fear, no challenge, just silence, like Homelander was being measured rather than confronted. Then Homelander noticed the shapes behind him. The retrieval team wasn't gone. They were standing upright in the alley mouth, faces blank, movements stiff but synchronized. Their tactical rifles hung uselessly at their sides. Their eyes were dark, like light no longer reflected inside them. They weren't alive in any way Homelander understood, but they weren't corpses either. Homelander's smile faded for the first time in years. The man finally moved, not toward Homelander but past him, walking calmly down the sidewalk. The standing figures followed without a command being spoken. They moved like a unit, not like people. Homelander turned slowly, watching them go, unsure whether he had just been ignored or warned. From a rooftop across the street, Billy Butcher lowered his binoculars with a frown that deepened into something more thoughtful than anger. He had come expecting to document another Vought mess. What he saw instead was a man who dismantled Supes without theatrics, without cruelty, and without caring who was watching. Butcher had spent years hunting monsters who loved attention. This one moved like a professional clearing a room. He muttered that this wasn't a Supe problem. This was something worse. Over the next 6 hours, reports started stacking up across the city. Minor Supes responding to crimes and never returning. Surveillance failures in areas where the hooded man was last seen. Civilians reporting black figures standing in doorways after violent incidents. None of it made sense individually. Together, it formed a pattern Vought couldn't explain. Every place he visited ended with fewer Supes and more unexplained sightings of silent figures that matched no living person. Inside Vought, the conclusion finally surfaced. Every Supe who engaged him was no longer missing. They were being added. When analysts overlaid timestamps and locations, they realized the numbers were increasing geometrically. The more they sent, the larger the group following him became. He wasn't fighting for survival. He was harvesting. Homelander demanded authorization to eliminate the threat. Vought hesitated for the first time in his career. They weren't sure killing the man would solve anything. They were no longer certain what would happen if he died. Because none of the figures following him were alive in the first place. As night fell, the city cameras caught the clearest image yet. The man standing at a quiet intersection under a flickering streetlight. Behind him, 12 dark figures stood in perfect stillness, each one shaped like a former Supe or Vought operative reported missing that day. The shadows at their feet weren't cast by the light. They spread outward on their own, connecting like veins across the pavement. And for the first time since Compound V created gods out of celebrities, New York felt like it belonged to something that didn't want applause, didn't want power, and didn't care who ruled it. It only cared about what fell. High above, Homelander hovered in the clouds, watching from a distance he would never admit to. He told himself he was studying the situation, preparing, waiting for the right moment, but the truth pressed quietly against his thoughts. He had never seen a fight where winning made the enemy stronger. Down on the street, the man finally looked up as if he knew he was being watched. His eyes didn't glow. His posture didn't change. But the figures behind him shifted slightly, reacting to a command that no one heard. Across the city, 3 more Supes went missing within the hour. And for the first time in Vaught's history, they issued a silent internal order not to engage a target. Because every attempt to stop him had already become part of his army. Homelander did not sleep that night, though he told himself he didn't need to. He stayed in the upper air currents above Manhattan, watching the city as if altitude could restore his sense of control. Every few minutes, Another internal Vought alert pinged across his earpiece, reporting missing Supes, unexplained camera failures, and civilians describing dark soldiers standing motionless in alleys. The pattern was obvious now. The stranger wasn't attacking randomly. He was moving with intention. Inside Vought International, executives argued over language. They refused to label the man a threat publicly because doing so meant admitting someone existed outside their system. But privately, the wording changed. He was no longer unknown asset. He was designated a growing event, something that worsened the more it was interacted with. Homelander hated the phrasing. Just before dawn, satellite tracking confirmed the man had stopped moving. He stood in an abandoned rail yard at the edge of the city, surrounded by freight containers and rusted steel. No civilians, no cameras, no witnesses. It felt like an invitation, and Homelander convinced himself that meant opportunity. He landed hard enough to buckle metal beneath his boots, heat vision already glowing faintly in anticipation. He wasn't here to talk this time. He wasn't here to observe. This would be a demonstration, a reminder to the world that no matter what walked into it, he was still the apex. The man stood in the open yard with his hands at his sides, coat barely shifting in the morning wind. Around him, 15 dark figures waited in stillness, their silhouettes recognizable as former Supes and Vought operatives. They didn't breathe. They didn't fidget. They simply existed as if waiting for a signal. Homelander spoke first again, but this time his voice carried an edge. He demanded the man identify himself. No response came, not defiance, not fear, just observation. The same quiet measuring that unsettled him the night before. Heat vision fired without warning. The beam tore across the yard, slicing through steel containers before striking the ground where the man had been standing. The explosion of molten metal and dust swallowed the space in seconds. Homelander hovered, satisfied for half a breath, expecting movement, screams, or retaliation. Instead, something moved inside the smoke that didn't look like a person running. A shape slid across the ground like liquid darkness, reforming behind him without a sound. Homelander turned too late. A force struck his back with enough weight to send him crashing through 2 cargo containers before he regained control midair. He hadn't seen a punch. He hadn't seen an attacker. He had simply been hit. When the dust cleared, the man was standing where he had been before, untouched. The figures around him had shifted. 2 now stood slightly ahead of the rest, their posture angled toward Homelander like trained soldiers. Homelander recognized one of them immediately. Shockwave, a Supe with concussive force abilities who had gone missing hours earlier. Shockwave's eyes were empty. Homelander shot forward at supersonic speed, fist cocked back with enough force to level buildings. He collided with the man in a blur of motion, driving him across the rail yard in a shockwave that shattered windows half a mile away. Metal screamed as containers crumpled under the impact. For the first time, the man reacted. Not with anger, not with panic, with efficiency. He redirected Homelander's momentum, using it against him, and slammed him into the ground with a precision that felt practiced rather than desperate. The crater beneath them spread outward in a perfect circle. Homelander felt the impact rattle through his bones, not painful, but wrong, as if physics had been applied to him correctly for the first time in years. He rose instantly, furious now, and unleashed everything at once. Heat vision, sonic claps, raw speed. The yard became a storm of destruction. Steel melted, concrete split, air pressure detonated like artillery. Through all of it, the man moved minimally, stepping just enough to avoid the worst of each attack. He wasn't trying to overpower Homelander. He was studying him. Then the shadows moved. Shockwave and the other figures rushed forward in perfect synchronization. They didn't hesitate, didn't show fear, and didn't slow when Homelander tore through them with brute force. Every time he blasted one apart, the pieces collapsed into darkness on the ground and reformed seconds later behind him. Homelander realized he wasn't fighting enemies. He was fighting resources. From a rooftop miles away, Billy Butcher watched the distant shockwaves ripple across the skyline through stolen surveillance feeds. He expected to see Homelander winning by now. Instead, the footage showed something deeply uncomfortable. Homelander wasn't dominating. He was being contained. Butcher muttered that this was the first time he'd seen Homelander look like prey. Back in the rail yard, Homelander grabbed one of the shadow figures and hurled it into the sky, disintegrating it with sustained heat vision. He waited for it to fall back. It didn't. For a moment, he felt relief. Then the ground behind him darkened, and the figure rose again as if nothing had happened. Homelander finally understood the problem. Every action he took was meaningless. He rushed the man again, faster, harder, abandoning tactics for raw violence. The man met him head-on this time, their collision splitting the yard in half. Homelander swung with everything he had, but each strike met something that didn't feel like flesh. It felt like hitting reinforced stone wrapped in human shape. The man countered with a single, precise strike to Homelander's chest. Homelander flew backward, skidding across the rail yard until he hit the perimeter fence and tore through it. He stood slowly, breathing heavier than he cared to admit. Not injured, but shaken in a way he couldn't rationalize. The man hadn't attacked with rage. He had corrected him. Vought's satellites recorded the entire encounter. Analysts watched in silence as the data confirmed something terrifying. The stranger's movements were becoming more efficient as the fight continued. He was adapting in real time. He wasn't struggling. He was learning. Homelander hovered again, reconsidering for the first time in his life whether continuing a fight was wise. That hesitation cost him something he didn't expect. The man stepped forward, and the shadows behind him spread outward across the rail yard like a tide. Homelander felt it before he understood it. The ground beneath him wasn't solid anymore. Darkness crawled upward around his boots, not grabbing, not restraining, but enclosing the space, limiting movement without force. A battlefield shaped without touching him. Homelander blasted upward, escaping the encroaching dark, and hovered high above the yard. He stared down at the man who hadn't pursued him, hadn't taunted him, hadn't even looked winded. The message was clear without being spoken. This fight could continue forever. And the only one losing something permanent would be Homelander. He left. Not in retreat, he told himself, in strategy, in patience, in planning, but the truth settled heavily in his chest as he flew back toward the city. He had just fought someone who didn't need to win to make him weaker. Down in the rail yard, the man stood alone as the shadows returned to stillness around him. The morning sun rose over the wreckage, casting light that failed to thin the darkness at his feet. Across New York, Vought issued another silent order. No Supes was to engage the target under any circumstances. An hour later, 3 more Supes disappeared anyway. Because fear didn't travel through Vaught's command structure fast enough. And every disappearance added another figure to the silent line, forming behind the man, who walked the city like it was already conquered. By mid-morning, Vought International stopped pretending this was a public relations problem. The screens in their command center no longer showed news feeds or social trends. They showed maps, red dots marking every confirmed sighting of the man now identified internally as Sung Jin-Woo. Black dots marking the last known positions of missing Supes. The disturbing part was how often the two overlapped. An analyst overlaid the data and noticed the pattern wasn't random. Jin-Woo wasn't wandering. He was moving along infrastructure lines, subways, transit hubs, service tunnels, maintenance corridors. Places Supes rarely patrolled because there was no audience there. Places with blind spots. Places where people could disappear quietly. Vaught's executives realized something that made the room go quiet. He wasn't fighting Supes for attention. He was clearing the parts of the city Vought never bothered to watch. They activated a protocol that had never been used before. Not military, not law enforcement, something closer to containment for biological hazards. They called in specialized teams equipped with sensors tuned for radiation, heat, electromagnetic anomalies, anything that might register his power. They hoped data would give them leverage. The first team entered a subway maintenance corridor, where a minor telekinetic Supe had gone missing an hour earlier. Their body cams recorded the moment the flashlights began to flicker. The corridor ahead wasn't dark, it was dense. Like the air itself had thickened into shadow. The team leader whispered for the others to hold position. His voice echoed strangely, swallowed before it could travel far. They advanced anyway, rifles raised, breathing audible inside their helmets. Then they saw him. Jin-Woo stood at the far end of the tunnel, still as a statue. Behind him, figures lined the walls like silent sentries. The missing telekinetic stood among them, head slightly bowed, eyes hollow. The team didn't fire. Something in their instincts told them bullets would mean nothing here. One of the operatives tried to speak, asked if he could hear them. Jin-Woo didn't move. The floor beneath the team darkened. It wasn't fast, it didn't rush them. It simply spread outward, touching their boots like ink dropped in water. One operative panicked and fired a burst into the wall. The sound cracked through the tunnel and died instantly. No echo, no ricochet. When the feed cut to static, Vought's command center didn't need confirmation. They already knew what the result would be. They marked 5 more black dots on the map. High above the city, Homelander floated outside the windows of Vought Tower, listening to the arguments through superhuman hearing. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the center of the room he wasn't in. They weren't asking what he wanted to do. They were asking what would happen if he did anything at all. That irritated him more than fear. He told himself the only reason he hadn't ended this already was because Vought kept hesitating. Because they didn't understand strength the way he did. But beneath that justification was a memory he couldn't shake. The rail yard, the shadows, the realization that force meant nothing. Inside another part of the city, Billy Butcher studied the same map through hacked feeds. He noticed the pattern faster than Vought had. The man wasn't hunting Supes randomly. He was intercepting them before they could cause collateral damage. Every disappearance corresponded to a situation where a Supe had been about to make things worse. Butcher leaned back, uneasy. This wasn't a predator rampaging. This was a cleaner removing threats with surgical precision. That should have made him feel relieved. Instead, it made him realize something worse. If this man decided humans were part of the mess, there would be nothing anyone could do. By afternoon, rumors began spreading among the public faster than Vought could suppress them. Grainy photos of dark figures standing behind police lines. Stories of Supes arriving at crime scenes and never leaving. Civilians whispering about a shadow man who appeared wherever Supes went too far. Fear spread before understanding could catch up. Vought tried a different approach. They deployed non-Supe assets. Armored drones entered a warehouse district where Jin-Woo had last been spotted. The drones were equipped with high-yield explosives designed to level structures if necessary. They moved silently between buildings, scanning for heat signatures. One drone detected movement inside a loading bay and fired immediately. The explosion tore the warehouse apart. When the smoke cleared, Jin-Woo stood in the center of the ruined floor, untouched. The blast had carved a perfect circle around him where debris had simply stopped midair before falling elsewhere. The drones adjusted their aim for a second volley. The shadows on the ground rose like hands. They didn't grab the drones, they swallowed them. Metal disappeared into blackness as if pulled underwater. One by one, the signals vanished from Vought's screens. A technician whispered that they had just lost $10 million of equipment. No one responded. Money no longer felt relevant. As evening approached, Vought made a decision they had never made in the company's history. They began evacuating Supes from major cities, relocating them to secure facilities outside urban centers, not to protect civilians from Supes, to protect Supes from Jin-Woo. The order didn't spread fast enough. A team of mid-tier Supes refused evacuation, convinced they could handle the situation themselves. They tracked Jin-Woo to a construction site near the river, surrounding him from all sides. Witnesses recorded the fight from distant rooftops. It looked chaotic at first, powers flaring, debris flying, Supes shouting threats. Then one by one, the noise stopped. When the dust settled, Jin-Woo walked out of the site alone. Behind him, 6 new figures joined the line of silent shadows. The footage leaked before Vought could contain it. For the first time, the public saw what Vought had been hiding. The dark figures weren't hallucinations. They were former Supes, standing without life but not falling. The internet didn't call them ghosts. They called them trophies. That word spread faster than anything Vought could erase. Inside Vought Tower, executives finally voiced the thought none of them wanted to say aloud. This wasn't a Supe. This wasn't an enemy. This was a force of nature operating on rules they didn't understand, and every attempt to study it had increased its reach. Homelander listened to that conclusion through the glass and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Irrelevance. Because if this man could remove Supes without spectacle, without needing approval, without needing fear, then everything Vought had built around him meant nothing. As night fell again, Jin-Woo stood at the edge of the river, the city lights reflecting in the water behind him. The shadows at his feet were no longer a small group. They stretched across the pavement in layered darkness, dozens of figures standing in patient silence. Across the river, emergency sirens wailed as a transport convoy carrying evacuated Supes tried to leave the city. The convoy never made it to the bridge. Traffic cameras captured the moment the road ahead darkened unnaturally, swallowing headlights in thick shadow. The vehicle stopped abruptly. Doors opened. Supes stepped out, confused and irritated. Jin-Woo turned his head slightly toward the sound, even though he was miles away. And the shadows behind him began to move. The convoy never reached the bridge because the road ahead stopped behaving like a road. Headlights shone into a stretch of darkness that looked thicker than night, swallowing beams before they could touch asphalt. Drivers stepped out first, shouting at each other, assuming a power outage or smoke. The Supes followed, annoyed more than cautious, confident that nothing in this city could actually threaten them. Then they noticed the silence. No engines idling, no distant traffic, no river sounds from below the overpass. Just a heavy stillness pressing against their ears like altitude. One of the Supes took a step forward and felt his boot sink slightly into the pavement as if it had softened. He looked down and realized the ground wasn't broken. It was covered. Shadows spread across the highway in a perfect sheet, thin as liquid but deep as a pit. They didn't move aggressively. They simply existed where light should have been. The Supes looked around for an attacker and saw nothing, which unsettled them more than any visible threat. From the far end of the highway, a figure began walking toward them. Civilians in stalled cars watched through their windshields as the man approached at a calm, steady pace. No rush, no drama. His coat shifted lightly in the night air as if he were taking an evening walk. Behind him, shapes formed gradually from the darkness on the asphalt, rising into familiar silhouettes. One Supe whispered a name when he recognized one of the figures. It was a teammate reported missing that morning. Panic spread faster than orders. 2 Supes launched forward at once, one flying low with kinetic bursts, the other charging with reinforced strength. They expected impact, resistance, a clash that made sense. Instead, the flying Supe slammed into an invisible force midair and dropped like a stone. The second Supe reached Jin-Woo and swung with full power. Jin-Woo sidestepped once. The Supe's momentum carried him forward into the waiting shadows behind, where hands that weren't hands pulled him down without struggle. His scream lasted less than a second before it cut off. The darkness flattened again, smooth and silent. The remaining Supes froze. They had fought villains before. They had fought terrorists, monsters, other Supes. Every fight came with noise, resistance, ego. This felt like stepping into deep water where the surface didn't ripple. They didn't know where to strike because nothing here reacted like a threat. Jin-Woo stopped walking when he was 10 meters away. He didn't speak. He didn't signal. The shadows behind him stepped forward in perfect unison. The fight didn't look like a battle. It looked like a correction. Supes launched attacks that should have leveled buildings, but every strike met figures that reformed seconds after being destroyed. Energy blasts vanished into darkness. Shockwaves dissipated as if absorbed by the ground itself. One by one, the Supes disappeared into the same stillness that had taken their teammate. From inside their cars, civilians watched in stunned silence. No one screamed. No one honked. It felt like making noise would draw attention from something that wasn't interested in them yet. By the time police sirens reached the overpass, there was nothing left to see. The convoy vehicles stood empty with doors open. No bodies, no wreckage, just faint black stains on the pavement where shadows had receded. And footprints leading away. Across the river, in a high-rise overlooking the city, Billy Butcher lowered his scope slowly. He had watched the entire event through a long-range lens, expecting chaos, maybe even collateral damage. Instead, he saw efficiency so clean it made his skin crawl. He muttered that this wasn't war, this was pest control. Behind him, his team didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. Inside Vought International, alarms layered over each other as the convoy's trackers went dark. Executives stared at the live feeds from traffic cameras, showing empty vehicles and confused civilians stepping cautiously onto the road. Someone asked how many Supes were in that convoy. No one answered immediately, because the number felt irrelevant now. What mattered was that the count of shadows following Jin-Woo had just doubled. High above the city, Homelander hovered again, listening to the panic through Vought's communications. He watched the man from miles away, eyes narrowing as the group of dark figures behind him grew larger than a platoon. For the first time, he considered something he had never allowed himself to think. What if this wasn't someone to defeat? What if this was something to avoid? Jin-Woo walked back into the city without looking behind him. He didn't check whether the shadows followed. He didn't need to. They moved when he moved, stopped when he stopped, and filled the streets with a quiet presence that cameras struggled to focus on. People on sidewalks began noticing the figures in their peripheral vision, dark shapes standing at corners in alley mouths beside closed storefronts. When they turned to look directly, the figures were gone. Rumors spread faster than news. People started avoiding entire blocks without knowing why. The city felt watched. Not by surveillance, by something patient. Vought attempted one last measure before admitting the truth. They deployed a classified sonic array from a rooftop, designed to disrupt nervous systems and incapacitate targets without visible damage. The device activated as Jin-Woo passed below, flooding the street with frequencies that should have dropped any living being instantly. Jin-Woo didn't slow. The shadows didn't react. The device overloaded and burst into sparks, as if the sound itself had been swallowed. Technicians stared at reading that showed the frequencies disappearing midair. As midnight approached, the number of sightings increased. Entire intersections where traffic lights seemed dimmer than usual. Reports of silhouettes standing on rooftops without moving. Police refusing to patrol certain districts after dark without being able to explain why. New York wasn't under attack. It was under occupation. And no one had seen the moment it happened. Jin-Woo stopped in the center of an empty avenue, looking down the length of the street as if measuring distance. The shadows behind him now stretched across storefront windows, up building walls, pooling at his feet in layered darkness. Miles away, Vought's emergency council finally used a word they had been avoiding. Containment had failed. Because this wasn't a threat spreading outward. It was a presence settling in. And as Jin-Woo resumed walking, the shadows followed like an army that had never needed marching orders. By dawn, the federal government stopped waiting for Vought to solve its own problem. Satellite images of Manhattan showed districts where movement had thinned overnight without any evacuation order being issued. Entire blocks looked abandoned, not because of destruction, but because people had simply left after hearing too many stories that sounded the same. Dark figures, silent streets, Supes not coming back. The Pentagon didn't ask Vought for permission. They asked for coordinates. Inside Vought International, executives tried to explain why conventional force wouldn't work, but the words sounded irrational even to them. They had no scientific model for what they were describing, no measurable data that translated into military language. So the government did what governments always did when faced with uncertainty. They sent overwhelming force to make the problem simple. Armored vehicles rolled across bridges into Manhattan before sunrise. Helicopters circled overhead with thermal imaging scanning every street. Infantry units moved in organized formations, trained for urban combat, expecting resistance that could be mapped and countered. They were prepared for terrorists. They were not prepared for absence. The first units reported that entire districts felt wrong. Sound didn't travel normally. Their boots echoed strangely against pavement that looked perfectly intact. Flashlights seemed dimmer than usual even though the batteries were full. A sergeant tried to explain it over comms and couldn't find the words. It felt like walking into a place where light had lost confidence. In a subway entrance near Canal Street, one squad found their first sign of him, footprints leading downward into darkness that swallowed the stairwell. The prints weren't deep. They were precise, deliberate. The squad leader ordered 2 men to follow while the rest held position. Their helmet cams recorded the descent. Halfway down the stairs, the men stopped speaking. Their breathing grew louder, faster. One whispered that he could see shapes at the bottom, not moving, just standing. He tried to zoom his camera. The image blurred as if the lens couldn't focus. Then the feed cut to static. Up top, the rest of the squad didn't wait for orders. They rushed down after them. None of them came back up. News helicopters caught glimpses of military vehicles parked on empty streets with doors open and rifles lying on the pavement. No signs of struggle. No bodies. Just equipment abandoned as if the soldiers had stepped away for a moment and never returned. The Pentagon escalated again. They authorized airstrikes. 2 fighter jets screamed across the skyline and released precision-guided munitions into a warehouse district where Jin-Woo had last been seen. The explosions tore the buildings apart in controlled fireballs that shook windows across the city. From miles away, it looked decisive. Final. When the smoke cleared, drones sent in to confirm the strike found him standing at the center of the crater, coat barely moving in the rising heat. Around him, dark figures stood unharmed, their silhouettes untouched by the destruction. The pilots reported something that made command go quiet. The blast radius had curved. Debris had fallen in a ring around him instead of on him, as if the explosion had politely gone around. On a rooftop overlooking the river, Billy Butcher watched the distant fireballs with narrowed eyes. He had seen military interventions before. He had counted on them failing against Supes. This was different. This wasn't failure from resistance. This was failure from irrelevance. He muttered that the army had just volunteered to join the collection. Across the city, reports came in of soldiers encountering dark figures in alleyways, under overpasses, inside empty buildings. They described shapes that didn't attack, didn't chase, didn't threaten. They simply stood in the path forward until the soldiers hesitated long enough for the ground beneath them to darken. By noon, command realized they weren't losing troops in firefights. They were losing them to hesitation. Inside the clouds, Homelander watched the jets and explosions with growing irritation. The military was doing what he hadn't been allowed to do: apply overwhelming force. And yet, even from this distance, he could tell it wasn't working. The man on the ground wasn't responding like an enemy. He was continuing his walk. Jin-Woo moved through the ruined district without changing pace. The shadows behind him were no longer a small formation. They stretched across the streets like an occupying force, silent and orderly. Some wore military helmets now. Others carried rifles they no longer needed. The world had begun adding itself to his army. The Pentagon made one final decision that afternoon. They classified the situation as a hostile incursion and authorized heavy ordnance if necessary. The language avoided calling Jin-Woo a person. It was easier to treat him like an event. But events don't walk. As evening fell, a battalion attempted to surround him near the financial district. Armored vehicles blocked intersections while infantry closed in from all sides. Loudspeakers demanded surrender to a man who didn't look up. Soldiers tightened their grip on triggers, waiting for something that justified firing. Nothing came. The first soldier stepped forward. His boot touched the edge of a shadow that hadn't been there a second earlier. He vanished without a sound. Panic broke formation instantly. Gunfire erupted in every direction, bullets tearing through air that swallowed the sound before it could echo. Shadows rose between vehicles, across building walls, along the street like veins spreading under skin. Within minutes, the entire battalion was gone. Cameras from nearby buildings showed only empty streets and armored vehicles sitting quietly in the fading light. And Jin-Woo walking away. Back inside Vought, executives realized something that made their containment plans meaningless. The military wasn't weakening him. It was accelerating his growth. Every attempt to stop him added more trained, disciplined figures to the darkness behind him. They stopped sharing information with the government because they didn't want to admit the truth. This wasn't a battle that could be won with numbers. It was a battle that lost you to him the moment you tried. As night settled over the city again, Jin-Woo stopped on a rooftop overlooking Manhattan. The skyline glowed normally, unaware that something fundamental had changed. The shadows behind him now filled the entire roof, hundreds of figures standing in absolute stillness. Below, sirens wailed in distant districts where military units had gone silent. Jin-Woo looked out over the city like a hunter surveying cleared territory. And far below, entire streets began to darken without any visible source. By the third day, international news stopped calling it a Vought incident. They stopped calling it a Supes situation. The language shifted carefully, nervously, into something broader. Anchors spoke about anomalous occupation zones in Manhattan where military units had vanished without combat. Footage showed empty armored vehicles, deserted intersections, and civilians describing streets that felt wrong after dark. No one mentioned shadows on live television. They didn't need to. Social media had already done that. Clips circulated from dozens of angles showing the same unsettling pattern. Dark silhouettes appearing behind police lines. Figures standing on rooftops where no one had climbed. Civilians whispering that when Supes arrived at emergencies, the shadows arrived first. And after that, the Supes didn't leave. Inside Vought International, executives watched the global coverage with expressions that had nothing to do with stock prices anymore. Their fear wasn't public panic. It was recognition. The world was beginning to understand the pattern Vought had already confirmed. This wasn't escalating outward. It was settling inward. They replayed every satellite feed, every street camera, every military transmission, trying to find a single instance where Jin-Woo had chased, rushed, or acted impulsively. They found none. Every movement was deliberate. Every confrontation happened because someone chose to engage him first. He wasn't attacking. He was allowing the world to fall into him. Across the river, Billy Butcher sat in silence with the rest of his team, watching compiled footage from the past 48 hours. He had built his life on understanding how monsters thought. He had expected this man to slip eventually, to show ego, cruelty, something exploitable. Instead, he saw a pattern that unsettled him more than any soup tantrum ever had. This man never escalated first. He waited. Butcher realized the implication before anyone else in the room did. The shadows weren't expanding because Jin-Woo wanted them to. They were expanding because people kept deciding to test him. And every test had a permanent result. High above the city, Homelander listened to world leaders arguing through intercepted communications. They weren't asking how to defeat Jin-Woo anymore. They were asking whether Manhattan should be evacuated entirely, whether the island itself had become compromised. The idea enraged him. This was his city, his stage, his proof of dominance, and now world governments were discussing abandoning it because of a man who didn't even speak. Homelander considered flying down and ending this himself again. He replayed the rail yard in his mind and felt the same quiet resistance pressing back against that thought. Not fear, something worse. Doubt. At street level, Jin-Woo walked through districts that now looked half abandoned. Storefronts shuttered, traffic thin, pedestrians moving quickly without knowing why. The shadows behind him stretched across entire blocks, no longer forming a tight group but spreading like a presence that occupied space without noise. People who caught glimpses of them stopped trying to explain it. They simply changed direction and left. Jin-Woo didn't chase. He didn't block them. He allowed the city to flow around him like water avoiding a stone. Vought attempted one last analytical approach. They compared Manhattan's current state to historical data from soup-related disasters. The difference was unmistakable. Normally, destruction spread outward in visible waves. This time, normal life was retracting inward, shrinking away from certain areas without knowing why. It looked less like a disaster and more like territory being claimed. That realization reached the Pentagon before Vought could contain it. Military analysts studied the footage and reached a chilling conclusion. Jin-Woo wasn't fighting a war. He was establishing control zones where resistance had already proven useless. And those zones were expanding. By evening, foreign governments began issuing travel advisories not just for New York, but for the United States entirely. The concern wasn't invasion. It was contagion, not biological but situational. No one understood how far this could spread if it wasn't contained. But no one knew how to contain something that didn't behave like a threat. In a quiet intersection near Times Square, Jin-Woo stopped walking. The billboards above still flashed advertisements in bright colors, casting artificial daylight onto streets that felt increasingly hollow. The shadows at his feet pooled thicker than before, covering crosswalk lines and curbs in layered darkness. Behind him, hundreds of figures stood without sound. A group of police officers at the far end of the street saw him and froze. They didn't raise their weapons. They didn't call for backup. They simply stood there, unsure whether approaching him counted as aggression. One officer stepped backward instead. The others followed. From a nearby rooftop, Butcher watched the exchange through binoculars and exhaled slowly. This was the shift he hadn't expected. People weren't trying to stop Jin-Woo anymore. They were trying not to trigger him. That changed everything. Because the moment the world stops pushing back, the one who remains standing has already won. Inside Vought, an executive whispered the question no one wanted to say aloud. What happens when there's nothing left for him to react to? When no Supes approach, no soldiers fire, no one challenges him? No one had an answer. As night fell, Jin-Woo turned his head slightly, looking down an avenue that stretched into darkness. There were no sirens now, no helicopters, no military presence. The city had grown quiet in the areas he occupied. He took a single step forward. Miles away, in a completely different district, the streetlights flickered. Pedestrians looked around in confusion as patches of shadow formed at their feet without any visible cause. No Jin-Woo in sight, no confrontation, no trigger. Just darkness spreading where it hadn't been before. Back in Vought's command center, alarms went off simultaneously across multiple screens. New zones of shadow activity were appearing far from Jin-Woo's current location. Areas that had never seen him in person were now reporting the same visual disturbances. The pattern broke their last assumption. He didn't need to be there anymore. The presence had begun moving on its own. The first report came from Queens, miles away from where Jin-Woo had last been seen. A patrol officer radioed in that the streetlights were dimming for no reason, not flickering from electrical failure, but fading as if something thicker than night had settled beneath them. His partner joked about paranoia until they both noticed the same thing at the same time. Their shadows were no longer matching their movements. They stepped forward. The darkness at their feet stayed behind. The feed from their body cams showed a black shape peeling off the asphalt like wet paint lifting from concrete. Neither officer had time to react before the cameras hit the ground and rolled, showing only the empty street and the sound of breathing that didn't belong to anyone visible. Inside Vought International, technicians replayed the footage in silence. The coordinates didn't make sense. Jin-Woo was confirmed to be on the west side of Manhattan at that exact moment. There had been no confrontation in Queens, no Supes involved, no military presence to trigger anything. Yet the shadows had acted. An analyst whispered the thought that had been building for hours. The army wasn't following him anymore. It was spreading his influence. Across the river, Billy Butcher watched multiple hacked feeds at once, his expression tightening as the reports stacked up. This wasn't a man walking through a city collecting trophies. This was a system establishing itself, expanding like territory that no longer required its ruler to stand on every inch of it. Butcher realized something that made him uneasy in a way Homelander never had. You couldn't track this by tracking Jin-Woo anymore. Because Jin-Woo wasn't the only moving part now. High above Midtown, Homelander hovered again, staring down at the streets with growing frustration. He could see the darkness with his own eyes now, not metaphorically. Entire intersections where the light seemed swallowed, where the air looked heavier, where people crossed the street instinctively without knowing why. He told himself he could burn it away if he wanted to. But he didn't descend. On a quiet rooftop near Times Square, Jin-Woo stood motionless, overlooking the city. The shadows behind him were no longer tightly grouped. They stretched across the entire roof and spilled over the edges like mist rolling down a cliff. He wasn't directing them. He wasn't gesturing. He simply existed, and the darkness responded as if proximity had become optional. Miles away, a minor Supe tried to intervene in a robbery in Brooklyn, eager to prove that the city still belonged to people like him. Witnesses later described the moment clearly. He shouted, posed, activated his powers, and charged forward. Before he reached the suspect, the pavement beneath him darkened. He fell through it without breaking the surface. The suspect dropped his weapon and ran, screaming that the street had swallowed a hero. By the time Vought heard the report, the pattern was undeniable. Jin-Woo didn't need to hunt Supes anymore. The environment itself had begun doing it for him. Any Supe operating within certain districts was now operating inside his territory, whether they realized it or not. This wasn't escalation through violence. This was escalation through inevitability. Back at their hideout, Butcher leaned over the table, hands pressed against the surface as he replayed footage from 5 different boroughs. No visual of Jin-Woo in any of them, just shadows acting independently. He muttered that this was the moment the problem stopped being a person. It became a condition. Vought attempted an experiment in desperation. They sent a drone into one of the new shadow zones with no intention of attacking, only observing. The drone hovered over an empty street, recording the unnatural dimness in the air. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then a shape rose from the shadow beneath it and pulled the drone down without disturbing the pavement at all. The signal cut cleanly. Technicians realized the worst part wasn't the loss of equipment. It was the implication. The shadows were reacting to presence, not hostility. Anything entering the zone became subject to it. As night deepened, entire neighborhoods reported the same quiet phenomenon. Streetlights seemed weaker. Sound didn't travel correctly. People felt watched without seeing anyone. They left without knowing why, abandoning shops and apartments in districts that had not experienced a single explosion or act of visible violence. New York was evacuating itself. Jin-Woo finally moved again, stepping toward the edge of the rooftop and descending the fire escape with calm precision. The moment his feet touched the street, the shadows in that block deepened noticeably, as if acknowledging his arrival even though they had been active long before he got there. Behind him, hundreds of figures followed in perfect silence. But now, even without them, the streets ahead were already preparing. Homelander watched from above as Jin-Woo walked into a district where no one else remained. He felt something in his chest tighten as he realized the truth he had been avoiding. The city didn't belong to him anymore, not in the way it had. Because ownership required presence. And Jin-Woo's presence was now everywhere. Inside Vought, the final report of the night came from Staten Island. A Supes transport helicopter had attempted to leave the city's airspace. Halfway across the water, the pilot reported instruments failing as darkness crept across the windshield from the outside. The last transmission described shapes standing on the air itself before the helicopter dropped from radar. No wreckage was ever found. Vought didn't issue any more orders after that. Because there was nothing left to order. On an empty avenue lit by flickering billboards, Jin-Woo stopped walking again. The shadows around him pooled thicker than before, spreading outward in branching patterns that reached far beyond his line of sight. For the first time since he arrived, he didn't look like a man moving through a city. He looked like the center of something that had already spread past the edges. And miles away, in places he had never stepped foot in, the darkness continued to grow. The decision wasn't announced publicly because no one wanted to admit it had been made. A joint task force formed quietly between Federal Command and select Vought handlers, built from operators who specialized in eliminating targets that couldn't be approached normally. No Supes, no uniforms, no noise, just precision, distance, and finality. Their objective wasn't containment. It was termination. Inside a dim command room, a city map glowed with marked shadow zones spreading across boroughs like ink in water. Analysts pointed to one moving center that still corresponded to a human silhouette on satellite. That was the only part of the phenomenon they believed could be killed. They circled Sung Jin-Woo on the screen. The plan relied on distance. High-altitude insertion onto rooftops surrounding his last confirmed location, coordinated long-range shots from multiple angles using rounds designed to penetrate armored vehicles, simultaneous detonation charges placed along his expected path. No warning, no engagement window, just removal. From a separate vantage point, Billy Butcher listened to the operation through stolen comms and shook his head slowly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't warn them. He knew this wasn't cruelty. This was desperation wearing discipline. But he also knew they were about to feed the problem. At 02:13 a.m., the operators took position across 6 rooftops overlooking a deserted avenue. Night vision scopes scanned for movement. The street below looked empty except for faint, unnatural darkness clinging to curbs and doorways. Then Jin-Woo stepped into view. He walked at the same calm pace he always had, hands at his sides, gaze forward. There were fewer visible shadow figures behind him now, which gave the snipers false confidence. They assumed the phenomenon had thinned with distance. They didn't realize the shadows were no longer required to stand beside him. The command came through softly. Fire! 6 rounds cracked the night in perfect synchronization. The bullets reached him. They stopped. Not midair, not against armor. They simply lost motion inches from his coat and dropped straight down to the pavement like gravity had been turned up for them alone. Jin-Woo didn't flinch. He didn't turn his head. He continued walking as if nothing had happened. The operators adjusted immediately, firing again, faster, compensating for imagined deflection. The same result followed. Metal hit asphalt with dull, harmless sounds. Then one of the snipers whispered something that made the others pause. His scope showed figures standing behind him on the rooftop. He hadn't heard anyone approach. Before he could turn, his feed went dark. Across the other rooftops, similar whispers cut off mid-sentence. Operators vanished from positions without a single shot fired back at them. From the street below, it looked like the buildings had simply gone quiet. Jin-Woo stopped walking for the first time. Not because he was threatened. Because the environment had finished responding. Explosive charges planted along the avenue detonated seconds later in a chain of thunder that shook windows for blocks. Fire and debris swallowed the street in a rolling wave meant to erase everything at ground level. When the smoke cleared, Jin-Woo stood at the center of a perfect ring of destruction again. The blast had carved around him, leaving a circular space of untouched pavement beneath his feet. Around the edges of the blast radius, shadow figures stood on walls and rooftops where the snipers had been. Butcher exhaled slowly as he watched the feeds die one by one. He muttered that this was the moment the professionals understood what the Supes hadn't. This wasn't a fight you could prepare for. Because preparation was just another form of approach. High above, Homelander watched the explosions from the clouds, jaw tightening. He had hoped, quietly, that this would work. Not because he trusted the plan, but because he wanted proof that this could be solved without him risking another direct encounter. The fireballs faded. Jin-Woo kept walking. Inside Vought International, silence filled the command center. No alarms, no shouting, just technicians staring at screens showing empty rooftops and a man moving through a city that no longer resisted him. An executive finally said what they had been avoiding. You can't kill something that doesn't need to be touched. As dawn approached, reports came in from districts far outside the operation zone. Shadows rising from beneath parked cars. Figures standing in building entrances where no one had been seen entering. A bus driver abandoning his route because the road ahead looked deeper than it should be. The failed assassination hadn't contained the spread. It had accelerated it. Jin-Woo reached the end of the avenue and turned a corner into a neighborhood that had already emptied itself overnight. The shadows there were thicker than anywhere else so far, pooling across sidewalks like low fog. He paused briefly, as if sensing the change in density. Then he continued forward. Miles away, Butcher turned off the comm feed and leaned back in his chair. He didn't look relieved. He looked thoughtful, because this wasn't a monster lashing out after being attacked. This was a system, adjusting to interference and growing stronger because of it. And the worst part was, Jin-Woo still hadn't shown anything close to effort. Above the city, Homelander hovered in place long after the sun began to rise. He realized something that made his hands clench into fists. For the first time in his life, there was a threat in his world that didn't care whether he showed up. That made him irrelevant. On the street below, Jin-Woo walked into a district where the shadows no longer waited for his arrival. They were already there. Dawn didn't make the city feel safer. It only made the shadows easier to see. From high above Midtown, Homelander watched sunlight spill across streets that still looked dim, like the light itself was hesitant to commit. Entire avenues appeared muted, colors washed thin under a layer of darkness that had no source. He had always believed daylight belonged to him. That belief felt fragile now. He descended without announcing it. No cameras, no speeches, no audience, just a quiet drop onto an empty street where Jin-Woo had been seen minutes earlier. The pavement beneath Homelander's boots didn't crack this time. He didn't land with force. He landed cautiously, as if noise itself might be a mistake. He followed the trail not by sight, but by absence. Areas where the air felt heavier, where storefront windows reflected less light, where the city felt paused rather than active. He hated that he could feel it now without needing instruments to confirm it. Ahead, Jin-Woo walked at the same measured pace, coat shifting slightly in the morning breeze. Homelander spoke before he was close enough to be heard normally. His voice carried across the street, sharp and controlled. He said this ends now. He said the city wasn't something you walked through and claimed. He said he was done observing. Jin-Woo didn't turn around. That dismissal hit harder than any insult. Homelander shot forward, faster than sound, fist aimed at the center of Jin-Woo's back with enough force to flatten tanks. He expected impact, resistance, a violent clash that would reassert reality. Jin-Woo stepped slightly to the side. Homelander's fist hit nothing. His own speed carried him through a glass storefront, shattering it in a storm of debris before he caught himself and turned. Jin-Woo stood in the street untouched, posture unchanged. Behind him, shadows pooled thicker. Homelander's eyes burned red instantly. Heat vision carved a line down the street, vaporizing asphalt and parked cars in a controlled sweep meant to erase everything ahead. The beam passed over Jin-Woo like light through smoke, scorching the world behind him instead. When the beam stopped, Jin-Woo was still there. Still walking. Something inside Homelander snapped. He attacked without restraint now. Sonic blasts, shockwaves, raw speed delivered in a flurry meant to overwhelm through sheer volume. The street became a storm of destruction, buildings cracking under the force, alarms screaming in every direction. Jin-Woo moved minimally, avoiding each strike with efficiency that felt insulting. He didn't counter immediately. He allowed Homelander to expend energy, to grow louder, more desperate, less precise. Then Jin-Woo moved once. His hand struck Homelander's chest with measured force, not rage. The impact launched Homelander across the block and into a concrete support pillar that split in half under the collision. Homelander rose instantly, but something had changed in his expression. Not pain. Recognition. The shadows around them began to rise. Figures stepped out from alleys, from beneath cars, from the edges of buildings. Dozens. Then more. Homelander recognized faces in the hollow silhouettes. Supes he had worked with, soldiers from the failed military response, people who had stood against this man and become part of him. He realized this wasn't backup. This was consequence. Homelander blasted through the figures with raw force, tearing them apart with heat vision and shockwaves. They fell into darkness and rose again seconds later behind him. No fear, no hesitation, just relentless presence. He understood the trap too late. Every second he stayed here, he was surrounded by something that didn't need to win to exhaust him. Jin-Woo finally stopped walking and turned to face him fully. Their eyes met for the first time. Homelander expected hatred or arrogance or challenge. He saw none of it. He saw assessment. That frightened him more than anything else. From a distant rooftop, Billy Butcher watched through a long lens, heart pounding harder than he expected. He had dreamed of seeing Homelander pushed back, humbled, forced to confront something greater. This wasn't satisfying. It was unsettling. Because Jin-Woo wasn't humiliating Homelander. He was categorizing him. Homelander roared and charged again, grabbing Jin-Woo and driving him through the street into the underground parking structure below. Concrete collapsed around them as they crashed into darkness. Dust filled the air as Homelander pinned him against a pillar, fists slamming down with everything he had. Jin-Woo caught one of his wrists mid-strike. Stopped it completely. Not with strain, with certainty. Then he pushed Homelander back with a single motion that sent him skidding across the concrete floor. The shadows filled the underground structure instantly, rising from every corner, every crack, every patch of darkness. Homelander looked around and realized something that twisted in his chest. There was no direction he could fly that didn't pass through them. He shot upward through the ceiling, bursting back into daylight in an explosion of debris. He hovered high above the street, breathing harder than he ever had after a fight. Below, Jin-Woo stepped out of the ruined structure calmly, shadows flowing back into place behind him. Jin-Woo didn't pursue. He didn't need to. Homelander understood the message without words. This wasn't a fight he could finish. And staying meant losing something he couldn't replace. He backed away in the air, slowly at first, then faster, putting distance between himself and the street. He told himself this was tactical, temporary, strategic. But the truth pressed harder with every meter. He had just faced something that didn't need to defeat him to make him feel small. Below, Jin-Woo resumed walking, as if the encounter had been a brief interruption. Across multiple burrows at that exact moment, new shadow zones deepened without any visible trigger. Because the city had just watched its strongest protector fail to matter. Inside Vought International, the tone shifted from crisis management to institutional survival. Executives who once argued about brand positioning now argued about evacuation routes. Entire floors of Vought Tower were being cleared quietly, sensitive data transferred to off-site servers, as if the building itself had become unsafe. Not because of an attack. Because Jin-Woo had walked within 3 blocks of it. Security teams reported that the lobby lights seemed dimmer than usual, not broken, just weaker. Employees exiting the building described a feeling they couldn't articulate, like the space behind them was filling with something after they left. No alarms triggered. No visible threat appeared. The fear came from anticipation. In a sealed conference room, leadership reviewed footage of Homelander's failed engagement. They didn't speak while it played. They didn't need commentary. The reality was visible enough. Their greatest asset had not been defeated. He had been made irrelevant. That realization broke something fundamental inside the room. Vought's entire system depended on Supes being the final authority in any situation. The moment that assumption failed, their control over cities, governments, and narratives unraveled with it. Across the city, news stations struggled to maintain normal programming. Anchors spoke about temporary evacuation zones and infrastructure instability, careful to avoid saying what viewers were already seeing. Streets that looked darker than they should. Entire neighborhoods with no pedestrians despite no official orders to leave. Rumors spread faster than broadcasts. People whispered that if a Supe entered certain districts, they didn't come back. They whispered that the darkness followed footsteps, that buildings felt occupied even when empty. And Vought had no statement to counter any of it. From a safe house overlooking the river, Billy Butcher watched the news with a grim expression. He had spent years trying to expose Vought's lies, to show the world how fragile their power really was. He hadn't expected it to collapse because of a man who never spoke to the public once. Butcher realized something that unsettled him deeply. This wasn't revolution. This was displacement. Vought wasn't being overthrown. It was being replaced by something that didn't care about ruling. High above the skyline, Homelander hovered near Vought Tower, listening to the quiet panic through the glass. He didn't enter. He didn't announce himself. For the first time, he felt like an outsider to the building that had always felt like home. He could hear executives discussing relocation plans. Not for civilians. For themselves. On the streets below, Jin-Woo walked through the financial district where traffic had thinned to almost nothing. The shadows around him moved like a slow tide, spreading across sidewalks and creeping into building entrances without resistance. The city didn't fight it. It simply yielded space. As he passed within sight of Vought Tower, something subtle changed. The shadows climbing the glass exterior grew darker. Inside, lights flickered across multiple floors at once. Elevators halted between levels. Security feeds glitched as dark shapes appeared briefly in corridors where no one stood. Employees trapped in stairwells reported seeing figures on landings that vanished when approached. No one said Jin-Woo had entered the building. But the building reacted as if he had. Vought's leadership made the decision then. They ordered a full evacuation of Vought Tower, quietly, without press releases, without acknowledgement. They didn't want the world to see their retreat. Because retreat implied defeat. As executives hurried through back exits into waiting vehicles, they passed through lobbies that felt colder than usual. The marble floors reflected less light. The air seemed heavier, as if the building had been claimed without a door ever opening. One executive looked back at the tower and whispered that it felt like the building had been hollowed out from the inside. Miles away, Butcher watched the evacuation through hacked traffic cams and exhaled slowly. This was the moment he understood the scale of what had happened. Vought wasn't losing control because Jin-Woo attacked them. They were losing control because he had made their presence unnecessary. As night fell again, entire corporate districts went dark. Office lights turned off not because of power failure, but because no one was left inside to turn them on. The city's financial heart beat slower, quieter, as if it had been told to rest without knowing why. Jin-Woo stopped in the middle of an empty plaza and looked up at the skyline. Behind him, hundreds of shadow figures stood in patient silence. Across multiple boroughs at the same moment, new buildings reported the same phenomenon Vought Tower had experienced. Flickering lights, security cameras failing, people feeling watched in spaces they had just vacated. The presence was no longer tied to streets. It had begun seeping into structures. High above, Homelander watched the darkened windows of Vought Tower and felt something settle in his chest that he couldn't fight with strength. This wasn't an enemy he could punch. This wasn't a threat he could intimidate. This was something that made his existence optional. Below, Jin-Woo resumed walking, passing through districts that no longer felt owned by corporations, governments, or Supes. They felt unclaimed. And the shadows moved to fill that space without being asked. The shift didn't happen in New York. It happened when reports started coming from cities that had never seen Jin-Woo. Los Angeles police described intersections where streetlights dimmed without electrical failure. London transit workers reported tunnels where sound seemed swallowed before echoes could form. Tokyo commuters filmed dark silhouettes standing at platform edges that vanished when approached. None of these places had Supes vanishing. None had military interventions. But the shadows were there. Inside emergency briefings across multiple governments, analysts overlaid timelines and reached a conclusion that silenced entire rooms. The phenomenon was no longer geographically linked to Jin-Woo's movement. It was spreading through awareness, through presence, through something that behaved less like a person and more like a condition attaching itself to the world. They stopped asking how to stop him. They started asking how far this could go. Back in New York, Billy Butcher watched foreign news feeds with a slow, dawning realization. This was the part he hadn't predicted. He had assumed Jin-Woo would dominate the city, maybe the country. He hadn't imagined the effect would echo outward into places untouched by the original conflict. Butcher leaned back and muttered that this wasn't occupation anymore. It was inheritance. Inside abandoned sections of Vought International, security cameras still running on backup power recorded empty corridors where shadows clung to walls longer than light could justify. No movement, no figures, just the sense that the building hadn't been left alone after evacuation. Executives watching remotely realized something chilling. The shadows weren't following Jin-Woo. They were following the pattern he introduced. High above Manhattan, Homelander hovered in silence, listening to global panic ripple through military channels. He heard foreign generals speaking the same way Vought had days earlier, confused, frustrated, powerless in language he had never associated with authority. He felt the weight of it settle in. This wasn't a rival. This was the end of the idea that he mattered. On a quiet street below, Jin-Woo walked past buildings that had gone dark days ago. The shadows at his feet were thicker now, spreading outward in branching veins that reached beyond sight. Behind him, his army stood in silent formation, but they no longer looked like the source of the problem. They looked like its evidence. A news helicopter dared to approach Manhattan's airspace to capture footage. The camera zoomed in on Jin-Woo from above, broadcasting his calm walk live before producers could cut the feed. Viewers around the world saw what Vought had tried to contain for days. A man walking through a city that no longer resisted him. Behind him, figures that were once Supes, soldiers and people who had tried to stop him. The broadcast lasted 12 seconds before the signal failed. It was enough. Governments stopped issuing tactical plans and began issuing public advisories, not about fighting back, about avoiding certain areas, about minimizing engagement, about waiting. The world had shifted from defense to avoidance. That was the moment they understood they couldn't win. Because winning required confrontation. And confrontation only made the phenomenon stronger. Butcher turned off the feeds and stared at the wall. He had hunted monsters his entire life, believing that if you pushed hard enough, you could force them into mistakes. Jin-Woo didn't make mistakes because he didn't chase outcomes. He allowed them. As night fell again, Jin-Woo stopped at an intersection where no cars had passed for hours. The billboards above still flickered, but their light seemed swallowed before it reached the ground. The shadows around him pulsed slightly, as if responding to something distant and unseen. Across the ocean, in cities that had never heard his name a week ago, people stepped back from patches of darkness that didn't behave like normal night. Homelander watched from above, and finally accepted something he had resisted since the rail yard. This wasn't something to defeat. This was something to survive around. Jin-Woo resumed walking, unhurried, unaffected by the scale of what had begun. He didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like a man clearing a path that the world kept stepping into. And thousands of miles away, in places he had never set foot, the darkness continued to grow without needing him there. The world didn't end with explosions. It ended with adjustment. Weeks after Jin-Woo first walked into Manhattan, cities across the globe had learned to function around areas where light felt thinner and sound felt swallowed. Governments stopped trying to clear these districts. They mapped them instead, marking places people avoided without needing to be told why. They called them quiet zones. No one called them safe. In New York, entire neighborhoods remained structurally intact yet permanently abandoned. Storefronts untouched, vehicles parked neatly at curbs, apartment windows closed as if their owners had stepped out for a moment and never returned. The city looked preserved, not destroyed. Like something had claimed it without needing to break it. Inside the hollow shell of Vought International, emergency lights still glowed in empty corridors. Dust settled slowly on desks where executives had fled without finishing conversations. Security feeds showed nothing moving, yet the darkness along the walls never quite receded. The company that once controlled Supes, cities and governments no longer mattered. Because Supes no longer defined the balance of power. From a hidden vantage point overlooking the river, Billy Butcher watched boats pass carefully around sections of water where reflections looked wrong. He had spent his life fighting to bring monsters down to human level. Now, he watched the world adapt to something beyond that scale entirely. He realized the fight he dedicated his life to had been made obsolete. Not solved. A groan. High above, Homelander no longer hovered over the city with pride. He avoided certain districts without admitting why. He still appeared on broadcasts, still smiled for cameras, still played the role the world expected. But he never flew near the quiet zones. Because he knew the truth now. There were places where he didn't matter. On an empty avenue bathed in early morning light, Jin-Woo walked alone. The shadows at his feet were no longer a tight mass. They spread outward across blocks, into buildings, through streets he didn't need to visit personally anymore. His army still followed, silent and disciplined, but they no longer looked like the source of fear. They looked like reminders. People who passed near the edge of these zones felt watched without seeing anyone. They turned back instinctively. They learned the boundaries without maps. Life continued around the edges of something no one challenged anymore. The world hadn't been conquered. It had been conditioned. Jin-Woo stopped at an intersection that had once been crowded with traffic and noise. Now it stood quiet, preserved like a memory. He looked down the empty street with the same calm expression he had worn since the beginning. He had never raised his voice, never declared intent, never demanded control. He had simply walked, and the world had rearranged itself around that fact. Miles away, new reports came in from cities that had never seen him. Patches of darkness forming in subway tunnels, streetlights dimming for no electrical reason, people stepping away from areas that felt heavier than they should. The pattern continued without him needing to be present. Butcher read those reports in silence and understood the final truth. This wasn't something that would fade when Jin-Woo left. It wasn't tied to his location anymore. It was tied to the precedent he had set. Resistance feeds it. Avoidance spreads it. And nothing stops it. Jin-Woo resumed walking, disappearing into a district where the shadows were thick enough to blur his outline. His figure faded not because he hid, but because the environment accepted him fully now. Behind him, the silent army moved as one. Across the city, across the country, across oceans, the quiet zones continued to expand without violence, without warning, without anyone daring to test their limits again. The world didn't return to normal. It learned to live beside something that had already won without needing to prove it. And in places far beyond New York, where no one had ever heard his name, the streetlights dimmed slightly as the shadows beneath them deepened on their own. Something had already begun. And it was not finished.